Welcome to today's session, which we've entitled ESG, What is Going On in the Boardroom? I'm Don Lohman, a senior partner at Korn Ferry. I lead our global total rewards consulting business, and I'm also a member of the core team responsible for developing and launching our integrated ESG consulting solutions. ESG and sustainability has become one of the most frequent and common topics of conversation with our clients, and that's true across industries and around the globe. And the conversations are occurring in boardrooms, executive suites, in workshops, on shop floors, and even in informal employee gatherings. Some of these conversations are simply about defining and understanding the issues, while many others are about what can we or should we be doing about them, and the steps that can be taken to achieve real progress. For today's session, we're assuming that our audience is already familiar with the definition of ESG, or environmental, social, and governance. Just as a reminder, here's an illustration of the range of stakeholders that care about ESG and where the pressure is coming from for organizations to address the multi-layered issues associated with this complex topic. And as you can see on this page, shareholders or investors obviously care about it a lot, customers and suppliers, employees, the capital markets, regulators and government, and the communities within which organizations and companies conduct their business. So it's pressure coming from all sides. We're very lucky to have assembled an incredibly experienced and expert panel to discuss this topic with us today, and I'd like to welcome and introduce each of them to you. First, Randall Stephenson. Randall is the former chair and CEO of AT&T. He retired at the end of 2020 after a distinguished 38-year career with AT&T, and before that, Southwestern Bell. Randall currently serves on the boards of directors of Walmart, the PGA Tour, and the Boy Scouts of America, and was previously a member of the boards of directors at Boeing, Emerson Electric, and Singular Wireless. Randall was chair of the Business Roundtable from 2014 to 16, and was national chair of the Boy Scouts of America from 2016 to 2018. He was named CEO of the Year by Chief Executive Magazine in 2016. Randall is long an advocate for social and environmental issues in his corporate life, and we're very lucky to have Randall join our panel today. Randall, welcome.
Thank you, Don.
Next, Ms. Karina Lipback. Karina is a member of several boards and advisory bodies in the US, the UK, and Italy. During her 25-year career in finance, Karina developed deep expertise in corporate governance, business ethics, and sustainability. She currently serves as an independent non-executive director on the board of the Italian oil and gas company Eni SPA, where she is a member of the Compensation Committee. She is also a member of the board of directors at Viridor Waste Management, CSA Institute, and chairs the Client Governance Initiative. Karina was previously responsible for running the governance and sustainable investment activities of F&C Investments, a UK institutional investor now known as BMO Global Asset Management, which is part of the Bank of Montreal. In her role, Karina acted on behalf of client portfolios collectively worth approximately 160 billion sterling pounds, focusing on equity research, shareholder activism, and public policy engagement. Karina is a native of Montreal, Canada, and currently resides in the UK. Karina, welcome. And next, George Seraphim. George is a professor in the Charles M. Williams Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Let me say that again. Professor Seraphim is the Charles M. Williams Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. He's an award-winning author and scholar and co-founder of KKS Advisors and RG Sciences. George serves on the boards of directors of Liberty Mutual and AEA Bridges Impact Corporation. He also serves as an advisor to the boards of several investment firms that focus on ESG issues as catalysts for value creation in the US, Europe, and Asia. George has presented his research to government and business leaders in more than 60 countries, and has been awarded many literary and academic citations, including being ranked among the top 10 of over 12,000 business authors by the Social Science Research Network. George earned a doctorate in business administration from the Harvard Business School and a master's in accounting and finance from the London School of Economics and Political Science. His latest book, titled Purpose and Profit: How Business Can Lift Up the World, is due to be published in the summer of 2022. George, welcome to the panel today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Don.
I'd like to just get the conversation started with a pretty easy question. I'd love to know when and how each of you first became an advocate for addressing the issues that we now group under the broad banner of ESG. Karina, let me start with you.
1988, actually. I was working as an investment banker, and I realized that I wanted to do something more. I didn't want to leave finance, but I wanted to do something more. And so that's when I made my move. And then from then, it's just been continuous until now. So it was a little bit marginal in those days.
Excellent. Yeah, I remember back to when CSR was sort of the topic of conversation, and we've come a long way since then. Thank you. Yeah. Randall, how about you?
I guess I'd have to say it was the day I became CEO and chairman of AT&T. AT&T actually, to your point, back when it was CSR and even before that, has always had a long history in being very engaged in the social side of things. They were the first company to ever come out and publicly support the Civil Rights Act. Oh. And that was not done in those days, and it was not entirely popular, as you might well guess. A long history of being the first to facilitate health benefits for same-sex couples. And so there's just a long history there. So you step into this role, and on the social issues particularly, you feel a really strong obligation to continue that legacy. But then also, when I stepped into this role and you look at it, AT&T is a very unique company in that it serves every demographic in the world, from the most wealthy, the largest corporations, to the lowest demographic in terms of earnings potential. And so I've always felt that if you're going to make business off of all those demographics, then you ought to internally reflect those markets that you're benefiting from and you're serving. And I think there's just a practical element to it that's very, very important. So, on the social side, it began obviously the day I became CEO. On the environmental side, when I began in 2007, there wasn't a lot of push and pressure for companies to engage aggressively on environmental issues. And it's actually a funny story. We have 100,000 trucks on the road and emitting a lot of carbon. And it was the first place I looked and said, there ought to be something we can do to address the carbon emissions that we're undergoing. T. Boone Pickens was my neighbor here in Dallas, Texas. He approached me about converting fleet to natural gas, which at that time was the most environmentally friendly option for automotives. And we began a process of converting our fleet, and we set out to convert 20% of the fleet. And T. Boone worked with us to how we do refueling and so forth. And then it just began to build from there. As you can well guess, we're a company that relies on electrical generation for our business. I mean, it's the telecom business. We just turn electricity into voice and data. And so we've just continued to go from there, but it's been a passion for quite some time.
Thank you, Randall. Thanks for sharing that. George, you've written a lot. You've researched a lot, obviously dedicating a good bit of your professional life to this. When did you first become interested and make this commitment?
Don, I started becoming interested when I realized that those issues were becoming more and more important from a societal perspective, but also at the same time, they were becoming more and more business relevant. And as a result, they were affecting the competitiveness of organizations over time globally. But that was happening for different reasons, and issues of climate change, for example, and diversity and inclusion, product safety and quality issues, governance and anti-corruption issues, and so forth. Everything that we blend around the ESG concept, they were actually manifesting very, very differently across industries and across geographies. So from a management and a governance perspective, it is actually a very complicated field. And as a result, you need to develop new knowledge, new capabilities, new tools, and new systems inside organizations. And that really motivated me because I felt that teaching here at Harvard Business School, I would be doing a disservice to our students as well if they were not getting equipped and capable to actually manage and govern those issues. So I ended up spending quite a bit of time trying to understand how you can measure the right things, how you can analyze the right issues, how you can drive performance on the right issues, and then how you can communicate and govern that performance. And I would say over the last 15 years, we have seen quite a bit of a revolution, I would say, and exponential growth compared to when I started writing on those things and working on those things, going from something that is super niche to something that everybody's discussing right now. But I would say still, I would say it's a very misunderstood topic, I would say, because many times it's oversimplified and it's actually quite complex.
Thank you for that. George, I'm going to stick with you on this next question to lead things off. I know we're all involved with boards that are obviously looking at ESG in very serious ways. For all of our audience here, do you think it's appropriate that board members are accountable for overseeing and supporting the development and implementation of ESG strategies? Or should this just be a management issue and boards shouldn't be involved? What do you think?
So the way that I think about this question, Don, is I think about it from the perspective of the long-term competitiveness of an organization. In an environment where different forms of capital, not only financial capital, but actually human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, natural capital, are increasingly defining the ability to be cost competitive, to grow revenues, to attract financing at good rates, and to really access new markets. And my thesis for a very long time is that all of those forms of capital are becoming more and more important for the competitiveness of organizations. So now if you take that thesis and of course you lay over the idea that different forms of capital have different importance in different industries and in different geographic contexts. So for example, if you are in the energy sector, obviously natural capital is something that is extremely, extremely important. If you are in the technology sector, that might be a little bit less important compared to some of the governance or the social factors, so forth. So the materiality, I would say, of the different topics varies quite systematically across different industries and across different geographic contexts. So, but if you take that premise, then you should arrive at the conclusion that the way that you incentivize, the culture that you build inside the organization, the metrics that you're reporting externally for people to be able and capital markets to be able to evaluate the business should be aligned with how the organization is creating value. So if you take that perspective, for me, it almost becomes tautological then that boards should, one, have the capabilities, but also the resources and the expertise to understand what is material from an ESG perspective for a business and how you can actually drive performance forward to make sure that you're incentivizing the right types of things and that you have the right accountability structures inside an organization to both drive performance, for the management to drive performance on those things, but also from a governance perspective to make sure that you have robust systems that are generating the right type of information that you need to communicate either to your investors or to other stakeholders. So I answered that question from the perspective at absolutely, because I actually view it as from a competitiveness perspective.
Thank you, George. Karina, I assume you agree with much of what George said. I'd like to know from your standpoint, how do you think boards can best prepare themselves for this task of providing the kind of oversight and support that's needed for successful implementation of ESG strategies?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because I have bumped up against it again and again when I reach out to fellow directors, on other boards, and the answer I often get is, oh, management's really got this one. They don't. That would be overstepping the boundaries of my role. I mean, we're not supposed to micromanage and so forth. And I mean, as George said, these issues can be existential for a company. They're about competitiveness. In the case of the oil and gas sector where I serve, they are a matter of life and death. We are a sunsetting industry, and if we do not completely grab hold of the climate challenge, we will cease to exist. It's that simple. So to suggest that, well, management's got this and our role is to comply with the EU CSR directive. There is a tendency oftentimes to think of it as management will bring us the latest report, and we will read it and we will say, well done, boys and girls. And we approach it from a compliance perspective. And it is so much more than that. It really is about saying, how is this anchored in our strategy? And if it is genuinely anchored in our strategy, what is changing about our strategy? And given the nature of these things, and climate change being one of them, but all of the issues that are kind of hooked onto climate change, like biodiversity, conservation, and so forth, these are things that play out over a very long time. And so, whereas historically, I mean, when I first joined my board 7.5 years ago, we did a 4-year rolling annually rolling 4-year plan, strategic plan. Now we look at 10 years and 30 years, right? And that was a very strange new way of thinking, where you have a lot less precision in the plan, but you still have to force yourself to think in that way. So that's just one example of the way that the board needs to be much more, I think, incisive in the way that we look at how sustainability feeds into the strategy, how it feeds into the enterprise risk management system. I mean, going back when I first started and I was on the risk committee, climate change would always feature in the low impact, low probability box of our quadrants. I kept thinking, really, we're in the oil and gas sector and climate is in the low probability or low risk. I think we can safely say that this is high probability and it is high risk, or high impact rather. So maybe we need to revisit the model, which we have now. And so we had to look at absolutely every aspect of the board's oversight responsibilities. Every committee had to rethink its role and how these issues really are woven into their oversight role. And oversight means asking, probing questions and understanding what the answers mean and understanding what is a satisfactory answer and what isn't. So I think it does, to your earlier question, it does call on directors to develop new skills, because otherwise we're not doing our jobs.
Randall, just turning to you for a second. I've dealt with a broad range of boards myself in the consulting that I've done, and I found that there is a very broad range of understanding of this topic, even a broad range of how much of a priority it is for different members of different boards. As you think about your own sort of involvement with boards, is this a topic that you think is taken sufficiently seriously? Do you think that have you? And I don't want you to go into naming names, but can you imagine where you'd need to find a process for getting all the board members on board with this as a topic, and what's the best way to do that?
Look, Don, when your board starts getting direct correspondence from your largest owners and telling their board that these are priorities for them as your owners, then they work for them and the board has no alternative. They better get familiar, they better get intimate, and they better begin to exercise oversight of these issues. I just, it's like having an owner, call about they didn't like the way your books and records appeared to them. Your board would be all over that, okay? And so boards, I don't think this is an option for boards now. And to that extent, now if you're a board member, this becomes one of your key risk management oversight responsibilities. And a lot of people have difference of opinions, but boards have to start getting to facts. They have to start getting to data. And that's what I'm starting to see. I've been associated with several boards and I'm now on the Walmart board. This is high priority in Walmart. You think about their supply chain and the implications for climate change for them, and then AT&T, the implications of climate change in that environment. These are really, really big, meaty issues. And I don't see it as an option for boards just to look to management for this. They've got to own it just like they own every other strategic and risk management issue.
I've got a question for all of you, and Randall, I'll stay with you for a second here. In terms of governance, I haven't seen too many boards appoint sustainability committees. I know that there's some, but it seems like currently the responsibility for it is vested among different committees or at the full board level itself. Do you think there's any value or need for companies or for boards to appoint separate sustainability committees?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a separate committee, but to your point, it can't be spread over multiple committees. So a committee and a committee chairperson of a board has to own it, because if one individual or one committee doesn't own it, then the old saying, nobody owns it. And so at AT&T, we put it under a very specific committee, and it became about 75% of their workload in that particular committee. Walmart has done the same thing. So all of what I'll call the ESG issues are inherently included under a single committee. And I think if you're not going to give it its own committee, then I think it needs to have a specific committee have full oversight of it.
Karina, what do you think?
Yeah, no, very hot topic. So we had what used to be called the Strategy and Scenarios Committee, because obviously in the oil and gas sector, scenarios are central to everything you do. And that was recast in 2014 as the Sustainability and Scenarios Committee, which effectively implies that sustainability and strategy are one and the same. And so that committee owns it, and I chair it, but nevertheless, the Risk and Audit Committee has a very big chunk that it does, and so we overlap, because when that committee oversees, for example, provisions and impairments, they draw on the intelligence that my committee generates in terms of scenarios. That is what feeds into the cash flow calculations, future revenue flow calculations, in order to determine whether an asset is, below its book value, and whether we need to take an impairment. And the same goes, for example, in our nominations committee, which is responsible for human capital. As we reflect on how the business is going to have to transform itself completely, and we're going to be cutting back dramatically on oil and gas production and ramping up dramatically in renewables and hydrogen and biorefining and all these different activities that are now core, our people have to change. And we have a philosophy that we don't trade them in, we retrain. And so that becomes a human capital priority for the nominations committee. Likewise, I'm in the remuneration committee, and we alluded to the fact that remuneration is pretty central to the way that you drive cultural change and to the way that you ensure there's alignment between what people are paid to do year on year and over their longer term LTIP, long-term incentive plan. That needs to be baked in. There needs to be proper alignment. So I can't think of a single committee where these issues don't come up, but I tend to be the one, sort of tapping people on the shoulder and saying, we need to talk about this. This is the piece you own, but we have a contribution to make to support what you're doing.
George, you've recently become a board member at Liberty Mutual, and I'm sure that they value your expertise in sustainability and these topics we're talking about. Do you see more boards looking for people like you that have this deep expertise in the subject and trying to add them to their boards? Or, alternatively, do they just think they could bring people like you in to educate them and that be sufficient? What do you think?
Don, let me answer this question and also connect it to the question that you just asked, because I have pretty strong opinions about that. And there are many things in life that I have strong opinions, but this is one of them. And the reason is because early on, about 10 years ago, when there wasn't much discussion about the intersection between ESG and governance, I would say from a board perspective, we wrote a report back then with the United Nations, actually, that we called Integrated Governance. And the basic idea there was that in my research, I'm oversimplifying this, but it probably gives a pretty good accurate picture of the landscape, is organizations go through 3 stages of development in terms of the ESG strategy. Most organizations start and see ESG as a compliance exercise. Basically, they try to make sure that nothing goes really bad. Then the ones that can move to what I call an efficiency stage, which basically they use ESG as primarily a reduction of cost and a reduction of risk type of driver. So they are becoming more operationally effective. And then a few organizations manage to move to the final stage, which is what I call innovation and growth. These are organizations where I actually see ESG as an opportunity to integrate in product offerings and open up new markets and drive revenue growth. And the rule of thumb that I give is that most of the organizations view ESG as a compliance exercise. Fewer you view it as an efficiency exercise, and very, very few, maybe 10% of the distribution will see it as an innovation and growth. And of course, over time, you see some migration happening as more and more organizations are happening. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because there is a natural curve that we have seen also when it comes to the, I would say, centralization versus decentralization of ESG knowledge, expertise, and functioning that is happening within organizations, but also at the boards. So one of the things that we found back then in the integrated governance report was that in general, organizations that were trying to move from the compliance stage to the efficiency stage, they were creating a separate sustainability committee at the board. And as a result, they were trying to create a critical mass. But actually, the organizations that were moving to the innovation and growth stage were actually diffusing those board responsibilities to the separate committees, to the compensation committee around, do you align incentives with ESG metrics, to the audit committee about the robustness of the management control systems and so forth, and so forth, right? And adopting, as a result, a much more integrated ESG approach. So the way that I personally dislike this idea that, a company can have a separate, sitting in the periphery, CSR or ESG department that basically nobody cares about, to be honest with you, in most organizations. Integration, I think, is really, really important for ESG to go from a compliance perspective to a strategy perspective. And I personally, what I have witnessed in many organizations, and I am very, very skeptical about, is when I hear basically that ESG is about reporting, ESG is about guidelines, ESG is about standards and so forth, I basically react and I say, this is just a compliance exercise.
Right, yeah,
Very little value creation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've, our own company has been talking about with clients on this subject is the idea of truly embedding it in the culture. And to avoid exactly what you just said. Otherwise, it's like, let's come up with a few metrics. Let's, be able to communicate to some audience that we've done this, check the box, and we're done. And I think to your point, as you go along the maturity curve with ESG, you'll see more and more organizations really trying to embed it in the culture and make it a part of everything that they do. And it is very integrated and not viewed as separate, little initiatives along the way.
Could I maybe push back on George just a minute and not push back, but maybe ask him to clarify, because the way you articulated it, many companies are early on their road here, and I thought it was really interesting the way you framed the growth curve of these particular things. But if companies that are early stage do not, at the board level, get a committee that is overseeing this and ensuring that the board broadly owns it and is directing it, I worry how, the broader strategy or approach that you articulated, the phase 3, how you ever even get there. And
I agree with you, Randall. I don't think we disagree. I see that's basically part of the journey, right? So part of the journey is actually setting up those structures, both from a governance perspective with a separate sustainability committee, but I say the same thing within organizations in terms of, for example, having a separate chief sustainability officer. That allows you to build the critical mass of knowledge, capabilities inside the organization. It is a must.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, and I want to illustrate this with an example. So I joined the board of an oil and gas major in 2014. At that stage, we were, top of the charts for our industry in terms of the quality of our reporting, and we were winning awards year in, year out, right? And Carbon Disclosure Project and all these different things, we were always great, okay? Except that we had never asked ourselves whether oil and gas was the business we really should be in and whether it was compatible with the direction of travel, right? Of a world that's moving to net zero. It just had not materialized as a question. It's a conversation I had with the CEO literally 3 weeks into my tenure and 3 weeks into his tenure as CEO, because he'd just been elected into that position. And we had a conversation at that point to say, we're in a business that is sunsetting and we have to reinvent the business that we're in. And so for a 6-year period, he and staff, with frequent poking from me, we're in discussions about, all right, so what is this actually going to look like? What's the business going to move towards, and what's the roadmap to get there? But during that 6-year period, it was still, we are the most transparent and we get the most awards, and our efficiency and our carbon intensity, they look great, they're progressively improving, but it's what George was describing earlier. It was fundamentally an excellence in compliance approach. And then boom, 2020 happened, and we said, that's it. We're actually going to transition out of this business. So oil's going to peak in 2025, and oil production and gas is peak in 2030, and all of our refineries are going to become biorefineries, and all of our chemicals business is going to become biochemicals and recycled chemicals, and all of our electricity is going to become clean electricity. So, all the way down the line, it's a picture of transformation and change management, right? But it took 6 years to get to that point. And for those first 6 years, I think we had a fairly self-satisfied group of board directors who thought, but we always come out first in every ranking. So what's wrong with us? We're the best already. And what's really frustrating? When you are the best already, it's very difficult to be that advocate for change in the boardroom. And I found myself saying, yeah, but we're the best of a fairly bad bunch. So let's look more widely, because you know what? People are going to steal our lunch because they're going to supply a rival product that is going to deliver heat and light and cooling and power and mobility, only it's going to be zero carbon, and then we will disappear, right? And it's not going to be from the rival oil and gas companies, it's going to be from someone else. And that was the thinking that we needed to really, grasp.
All right, we're going to turn our attention to a topic that is one that I'm really interested in, and it gets at how boards can hold leaders, executives accountable for successful implementation of ESG strategies. And there's both a theoretical and a practical component to this question. First question I would ask you is, should executive pay be tied directly to ESG initiatives? Now, before you answer, I want to set this up. Very few companies, at least in the United States, historically have singled out too many non-financial issues or priorities for directly providing incentive compensation. A lot of times they'll just say, look, it's embedded in total shareholder return, so it's already accounted for. We don't need to have it as a separate metric. And yet, we found that at least in the US, 60% or more of the S&P 500 now have at least one ESG metric built into one of their incentive plans, whether it's the annual incentive, the long-term incentive, or both. And it's even more over in the UK and Europe, is what I'm told.
Correct.
So now I'm an executive pay advisor. I can argue both sides of this issue. So let me start with George. Maybe start at a theoretical level, George, and then we'll go into the pragmatics of it. What do you think?
I think it really, I will give you a deeply unsatisfying answer, Don, which is it depends. But the reason why I'm saying that is, first of all, I think if you take a bottom-up approach instead of top-down approach, because a top-down approach says these are important things, everybody should align incentives. But I take a bottom-up approach, which is basically, what are the internal capabilities inside an organization? First of all, there are many organizations that actually don't have robust metrics about many important things. Right. And if there is one thing that we know is that actually tying incentives to very noisily measured metrics can actually be very bad. It can generate all kinds of bad outcomes, right? And I will give you a very simple example. So for example, most organizations can measure, I would say, fairly accurately Scope 1 carbon emissions. There are very few organizations that can measure very accurately Scope 3 carbon emissions, meaning value chain carbon emissions, either upstream or in the downstream. Of course, you have some great exceptions to that, right? We just mentioned before, Walmart, they have done a great job at being able to have those metrics. But there is a general argument there that the better is the measurement technology that you're having, the more pro I would be towards tying incentives, right? The second one, I would say, is the question about what kind of metrics do you have and what type of metrics are you actually tying incentives, right? So there are inputs types of metrics, there are process types of metrics, and there are outcomes types of metrics. And I would say in general, the general principle that I have is that in environments where the road to travel is a little bit more uncertain and you don't know exactly how you're going to get there, in general, trying to tie incentives to outcome-based ESG metrics is much better than trying to micromanage people and tying them to process type. But in other cases where you're actually seeking to optimize existing types of processes, having process types of metrics is something that works really well. Think about, for example, employee safety. That might be something that actually works pretty well. So I would say it depends. And to your question about, oh, isn't this all reflected in stock prices and as a result returns? I am quite skeptical about this very strong assumption of market efficiency as somehow that all these metrics are magically being represented in stock prices.
Yes.
The invisible hand sometimes doesn't work exactly that way.
Yes, agree with you. Another problem, I'm going to move on to Randall and Karina, but another problem that I see with the outcome-based metrics is the outcomes may be 10 or 12 years out, and the people you're trying to incent may not be here 10 or 12 years from now. So exactly Randall, over to you. You deal with this, obviously, you're a member of a compensation committee. You've dealt with this issue. What do you think?
I think businesses are really, really good at doing what you pay them to do. And so y'all be really careful out there, is what we would say in Texas. And I thought George framed it really well. I mean, how well can you manage it or measure it, I should say, and what outcomes are you looking for? And if you're going to just compensate for inputs without any real clear indication as what the outputs are, that kind of bothers me. I would also say George's terminology, it depends. It probably depends on industry. I listened to Karina talk about the energy company she's working for. There's a place where you're saying we have a pivot to make in our basic product set and our value proposition. You better compensate management to get that transition of their business done. A business like AT&T, it's probably less clear in exactly what are you compensating for in the short run. And so I'd say the businesses it depends on what the businesses are and how critical this is to their strategic viability.
Karina, I'm going to turn it to you, but I'm going to ask the additional question of, if we don't hold executives accountable through executive pay, what other ways do we have to make sure that we're holding them accountable, that we're keeping track of progress, that we're continuing to make it a priority that they feel accountability for?
I actually struggle to answer that second question, and I do think pay is absolutely critical. I mean, look, when you're looking to create a culture, a new culture, a lot of the times people are so enthusiastic about taking the skills that they've developed and putting them to the service of something that is about saving the world, for lack of a better phrase, that in many ways motivates them more than pay. And that's something that I've observed, particularly for the under 40s. I mean, they are unstoppable. If you put out, as our new clean energy business did, you put out the word across the entire 33,000 people organization that new ideas for new projects are welcome, send them in. They had to triple the staff to process all the proposals coming in because there was so much enthusiasm for it. But, to the points that were made earlier, if you pay somebody to do X, it's very difficult for them to do Y. So take the example of the oil and gas sector. It has always had a mix of financial key performance indicators and industrial ones. So the financial ones are the usual ones: cash flow, TSR, and return on capital employed. The non-financial ones have been a mix of health and safety, because of course you have to, but also historically reserves replacement, exploration success. Okay, now, if you've decided that you're going to reward your executives on the basis of where they place in a group of 10 peers on exploration success, and you're tying their arms behind their back by saying, we're actually going to cut back on production, so we're not going to explore as much, that's actually deeply unfair, right? And so you have to take that out and replace it with what it is that we want them to be doing. And what we want them to be doing is to be investing in this, in our case, in increased installed capacity of renewables. Now, that's an input. It's not an outcome, because it takes a while before that business starts to be cash flow generative, right? And yet we must incentivize those behaviors. And in fact, we had an interesting debate in the compensation committee a couple months ago, where our 4-year LTIP is tied into renewables capacity. And then they decided to add it into the annual cash bonus. And I said, wait a minute, investors are going to complain that we're paying people twice for the same thing. And what they said to me, and I thought this is so candid and actually very convincing, was, so here's the problem. If you give people a 3 or 4 year incentive, or 3 or 4 year incentive, they're going to start thinking about it on the eve of the last year. If you want them to get going now, you better pay them now. You don't pay them every year to get 1/4 of the way. That's how you drive cultural change. I thought, wow, you have to really be in the field to be able to see that. It would never have occurred to me. So they're back to the sort of perverse incentives and unintended consequences and so forth. This is what you learn by doing, right? And so I've learned tons by just seeing how this thing plays out.
Thank you. I've got one final question for each of you. And George, I'll start with you. ESG has obviously been a hot topic now for the last couple of years. It's gotten a lot of volume and a lot of attention. But for some companies, if we go into a prolonged recession or financial downturn, you could imagine that a lot of them would say, hey, this is not important to us right now. We need to worry about our financial survival. So we got to put this to the side. Do you see that happening? And if it does, what risk do companies run if they do that?
I think it will happen for many companies because for many companies, ESG is just an added cost. And again, compliance. Actually, this is a little bit of a study that we did during COVID, when COVID first hit. Because when things get tough, this is where you really understand for which organizations is integrated and it's part of the strategy. Because if it's part of the strategy, if it's part of the value creation, then you won't drop it. If it's something that you do it on the side and it's a luxury item, then actually you drop it during hard times. So that's when it gets real. And I think for me, ESG is here to stay because it's actually fundamentally driven by technology, changes in technology, changes in value and the way that we create value, and changes in values in society among customers, employees, investors, and so forth. But I think for board members, really the risk is that you actually step into an ESG field where you have increasingly more and more pressures from the outside to do just standardized things that everybody else has to do. And you actually don't have a critical eye about how is this connecting to the strategy of the organization? Right. Does this make sense for us? Or is it just something that is a cookie cutter approach and just fits everybody in the industry? And then you end up actually having the death of strategy, because strategy is about being differentiated, being about being unique. It's not being about everything to everyone. And I think that is the real risk of board members. And going back to your question about, for example, what is the importance of having skills and capabilities on the board? I think for me, one of the most fundamental reasons why you need those skills and capabilities, and for board members to be really well understanding of the ESG field, is they feel empowered to actually ask the questions and ask, does this make sense for us to be doing, or is it just an externally imposed standard on us because of expectations or different types of factors? I think that is really, really important.
Karina, pretend you didn't hear anything that George just said. And now, ESG, a passing fad or here to stay?
Absolutely here to stay. You know, when the pandemic struck, I had that wobble of, uh-oh, are we going to lose our focus. And I sat down with our CEO and I said, don't do it. Everyone's going to assume
Right.
that we're going to roll it back. Don't do it. You really have to accelerate in the curve. And bear in mind, in the oil and gas sector, everybody slashed CapEx by at least a third. We did the same, but we actually increased in the clean stuff. And all that happened is that in the space of that first year of the pandemic, we raised our objectives. We actually accelerated the transition. And the justification for that was that the pandemic really brought home this message that there are systemic risks out there that could destroy a business, even if you didn't do anything wrong. So take us. We have a fantastic chief medical officer with a great medical infrastructure across the entire business, 63 countries. He declared a pandemic emergency in January of 2020, 2.5 months before the WHO, right? Great. So we lost extremely few people. I think it was, in the 2 digits of people that we lost, including contractors. But our chief medical officer, he wasn't able to stop the collapse in the oil price. And that's what, really brought us to our knees, right?
Yeah.
And it's this interdependency of all of these factors, which, climate change is an even more dramatic example of that.
Yeah.
And so that made us realize, this is going to get worse before it gets better. And so we have no choice but to really grab this one by the horns and really move with it. No pandemic and no financial crisis is going to slow us from that focus.
Thank you, Karina. Randall, I'm going to give you the final word.
It's a hard question to answer, Don, because you listen to Karina and George talk, especially as it relates to climate change, for example. ESG is such a broad target and category, if you will. And I agree with what Karina just said as it relates to climate change. I don't see pandemics or economic difficulties changing companies' focus on that. But you get to some of the other elements, the social side of ESG, and whether it's D&I or others, I would say the jury's out on this. And I'll give you a classic example. Virtually every company in America recently has probably had an activist come in and engage with management and so forth. And when an activist comes in, you end up speaking to all your largest owners and getting their insight and their thinking on what an activist is saying. And I went through this the last couple of years I was CEO. An ironic thing is, of the companies that are really aggressive and assertive, I should say the capital markets, the owners that are assertive on ESG issues, when you start talking about new board members, the question wasn't, are you looking at diversity in board members? The question tends to be the way we've traditionally looked at board members. And so I'd say a lot of this is going to depend on what do the large capital markets, the owners in the capital markets, how do they behave? That's what will drive boards, and that's what will drive management more than anything else. And so I think the jury is out, and it will be interesting to see as we hit more difficult financial situations and volatility, how the large institutional owners behave as it relates to these issues.
We're going to need to leave it there. Randall Stephenson, Karina Lipback, George Seraphim, I can't thank you enough on behalf of our viewing audience for the time that you've spent with us today. It's been a privilege to have you. You've been generous with your time, and we've all gained greater insights as a result of your contribution. So thank you very much for joining us. And we'll see you all again. This issue is not going away. And I've learned one lesson from George today. It's okay to say it depends when it comes to a question around executive compensation. So thank you all, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.